Hello, this talk is about Romanesque architecture and art, and Romanesque briefly covers the period from the 10th century to the 12th century. It's a term that was coined in the 19th century, and the word was based on the fact that Romanesque architecture is similar to the architecture of ancient Rome with its rounded arches and thick walls. However, the art and architecture of Romanesque was equally inspired by Carolingian, Ottonian and Byzantine styles. It's also closely related, overlaps with Norman art, which is more localized and influenced by the Norse culture and the regions conquered by the Normans, which, as we will see, included northern France, England, Sicily, and southern Italy. And this part of the Bayeux tapestry we see here is to indicate that the conquest of England in 1066 resulted in the whole of England being part of the Norman Empire. But let's look at a map to clarify what's what in Europe at the time. This map is a political map of Europe in 1100. You can see the centre of Europe is dominated by the Holy Roman Empire, and to the west is the Kingdom of France, smaller than modern day France, and the centre of Europe was a single empire created by Charlemagne, but after his death it broke up into these two main regions, the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France. As I said, England was conquered by the Normans in 1066. There were various Christian kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, although southern Spain was under Muslim control, as was northern Africa. And over on the east is the Byzantine Empire. Incidentally, Italy was divided into various city-states, and the Papal States centred on Rome, centres like Florence and Venice, Milan and so on. But the important thing to say is that in Europe at this time, Central Europe, the Christian area was absolutely dominated by religion. In fact, around 1000, people expected the year 1000 to be the day of judgment, the end of the world, the second coming of Christ. And there was a religious fervour. Monastic orders were formed. There were many pilgrimages across Europe. And in fact, this map shows some of the pilgrim routes in these black lines across it. The pilgrims would visit cathedrals and churches that contained relics. Relics were extremely important. They created trade routes. Pilgrimages to churches and cathedrals containing relics resulted in wealth being brought to those towns and cities. It was also the period when the Crusades began. First Crusade was 1096 to 1099 with the objective, and in fact the First Crusade resulted in the seizure of Jerusalem, which previously was under Muslim control. Cathedrals became a massive industry across Europe. Technical skills were needed, and there were an elite corps of master masons who could design and construct them, who travelled around Europe, and this led to the creation of guilds, which expanded to include other trades and growth in the power of the craftsmen. But let's look at one Romanesque church to begin, Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. One of the best preserved and I think the largest Romanesque church in the world. Note its appearance. It's squat, it has rounded arches, it has no flying buttresses. Its power, and its appearance is one of massive, solid stability. It takes its power from the earth, if you like a mountain. It comes up from the earth. In contrast to the next period of cathedral building, the Gothic, where the aim was for the building to soar up to heaven, and churches were filled with heavenly light that came through enormous stained glass windows supported by external flying buttresses. More of that later, though, in my talk on Gothic cathedrals. But coming back to Romanesque, they did have stained glass, but the windows were much smaller. And inside, another feature of Romanesque is what you see up here, the barrel vaulting. As distinct from Gothic architecture, where we see much more design goes into the ribbed vaulting. Now, Saint-Sernin was built on the site of a 4th century basilica and contained the relics of Saint-Sernin. And because of that, during the reign of Charlemagne, its fame, because of that, led to him donating a number of other relics to the same church. And it became, therefore, an important stopping place for pilgrims. And it resulted in Toulouse becoming a wealthy city. It was relics that drove the economy of Europe at the time. This is the Abbey Church of Vézelay, founded in the 9th century, shortly after the formation of the Benedictine Abbey, which claimed to have the relics of St. Mary Magdalene, and therefore became an important site for pilgrims. You're probably beginning to understand the importance of relics and pilgrimages and the movement of wealth. Now, the door we see here doesn't go directly into the nave. It goes into what's called a narthex. A narthex is a sort of lobby area inside the door. And if we go inside the door you see here, we come across another door. We're inside the narthex, and this door you see enters into the nave. It's got a rounded Romanesque arch and a highly decorated tympanum. That's the semicircular area above the lintel above the door. Now, the symbolism of this tympanum is different from most Romanesque churches. It's actually a justification, a spiritual defence of the Crusades. Let's look at it a bit more closely. The narrative concerns spreading the gospel across the world and converting what they called ungodly people. And the ungodly people are shown here on the right of the lintel. Let me show you a close-up. You can see them a bit more clearly here. They didn't know how to represent the ungodly, so they show them as misshapen, physically deformed with pig snouts. And you can see one small person is using a ladder to climb on a horse. The thing is that most Westerners had no idea what Muslims looked like, and they assumed they must be physically deformed. Each side of Christ, there are 6 figures generally assumed to be the apostles, because you can see them holding books and scrolls. And then the upper compartment above them, this area here, contains representations of miracles performed by the apostles, like healing the sick and casting out demons. And then the archivolt up here contains a lot of sort of medallions or roundels, 29 of them. 12 contain signs of the zodiac and 17 are activities of the year. Let me show you a couple of them. I've marked them with blue stars on the far right. And I've shown an enlargement of them at the top. Top left is the sign of Capricorn, which is 21st of December to the 19th of January. And on the top right, there's a man holding a dish, as you can see. We don't know what this represents. Maybe it's a banquet held in the end of December, or it might be the sharing of bread and wine. In this tympanum, Christ is shown as benevolent, which is not typical. We'll see a more typical, what you might describe as angry, or perhaps better described as all-powerful Christ in the next church, which is this one, Saint Pierre Moissac in France. And in the tympanum, there's a more typical scene with Christ. Just before I show you that, Saint Pierre is a Benedictine and Cluniac monastery, and according to legend, it was founded by the Frankish king Clovis right back in 506, and following a victory, he is said to have thrown his spear and demanded a monastery be built on where the spear landed. A legend, probably untrue, a nice story. But in the 11th century, the monastery was sacked by both Moors and Norsemen, and a fire seriously damaged the building. So it was rebuilt in the 12th century, and following the rebuilding, Pope Urban II granted another 40 churches to the abbey, creating a very important and significant area controlled by the Abbey of Cluny, and it became one of the important churches on the pilgrimage routes. But let's before we move on, I said I'd tell you more about the tympanum. It's in shadow here, so let me lighten it up and let me expand it so we can look at it more closely. You'll see that in this tympanum, Christ's halo has a cross inside. That's called a cruciform halo. And you'll also see that round him there's an almond shape called a mandorla, which is the Italian for almond. Now, there were two popular subjects for tympanums, the Last Judgment and Christ in Majesty. The difference is the Last Judgment, we typically have scenes of hell bottom right and heaven bottom left. This is Christ in Majesty and shows the second coming of Christ and the end of time as described in the book of Revelation. And I'll just read you part. Behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne, and round the throne were 24 seats, and upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold. And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto a crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts. And the first beast was a lion, and the second beast like a calf, and third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. End quote. The 4 beasts you can see here and were linked to the evangelist. Matthew, upper left, is the winged man. Mark, below, is the lion. Luke is shown as an ox, and John the evangelist is the eagle on the top right. And the 24 elders, you can see The wavy lines you see are a way of representing the sea of glass like unto a crystal. Let's move on to Saint Foy, or Saint Foy, in Conques. It was a popular stop for pilgrims because it contained the relics of a young woman martyred in the 4th century, Saint Foy. And let me tell you a story which shows how valuable these relics were. So valuable that in fact some churches stole them from another church. And in this case, the abbey at Conques tried to steal relics from St. Vincent, but they were unsuccessful. So what they did is they opened a priory next to a shrine in Célestat, which is right on the other side of France, and a monk from Conques posed as a loyal monk for nearly 10 years in order to get close to the relics. And then when he was accepted, he got close enough to steal them. He was successful. He travelled across France with the relics and brought them to this church at Conques, where they've remained ever since. And because of those relics, the pilgrimage route changed from Agen to Conques, and they extended the church. They added this ambulatory behind the church, which is where the crowds of pilgrims would make their way past the relics. And in this case, the relics were down below and the ambulatory was high up in the gallery, and so they looked down through a metal grille. And the metal grille was made from donated shackles from former prisoners who had been released by the miraculous power of Saint Foy. But in the event, it wasn't so miraculous. What the monks would do is they would kidnap a random pilgrim, chain them up with shackles, sometimes torture them, and then they told the captor to pray to Saint Foy, and then they were miraculously freed, and they were so grateful they were told to donate the shackles to Saint Foy and tell everyone about the miracle that occurred. And it worked, and pilgrimage traffic increased and the wealth of the town increased. In this case, another tympanum shows Christ in judgment, and here you see bottom right, hell, bottom left, heaven. It's a bit hard to see in this case, but let me overlay this modern day reconstruction of what it originally looked like. Yes, they were all brightly coloured, and it's much easier to see what's going on. You can see in hell the demons, the people being tortured, and you can clearly make out the people going to heaven, and in fact you can see some people entering the door of heaven. It was just to remind you, this is a representation of the day of judgment, when Christ above in the centre weighs your soul and decides whether you're for hell or for heaven. And when I say you, this includes all the people living at the time and all the people who have died, who at the end of time rise from their graves to be judged and sent to either heaven or hell. A very common subject for representation in churches at the time. And also remember from this that all the tympanums, sculptures and inner walls of churches that I'm going to show you were all brightly coloured at the time. This is in the Dordogne. It's Souillac Abbey. And again, over the interior door in the west wall is a carved tympanum. But this is a different one. This is the story of Theophilus selling his soul to the devil. Let me explain what happened. Theophilus was a local high-ranking official who, out of humility, declined a bishopric, and then the new bishop that was appointed dismissed Theophilus, and he became so bitter he arranged a meeting with the devil, which you see here, drew up an agreement, and you can see the scroll of the agreement being handed over by the devil, and he renounced Christ and the Virgin in exchange for the bishopric, and within days he was made bishop and experienced greater power than he'd ever known before. But in time he regretted his actions. So what he did is he lay prostrate before the church for 30 days. The Virgin is said to have interceded, forgave him, and shortly after he died. And you can see behind him at the back there's the church that he lay prostrate in front of, and at the back on the left you can see him being raised up to heaven by two angels. Interestingly, they chose to represent not his forgiveness but the pact he made with the devil, and you can see there's two representations of him making an agreement with the devil and then holding hands with the devil to seal the agreement. I guess the reason they did this is they could show the devil and scare the monks into not thinking about doing any evil. Saint-Souillac. This is Saint-Servan, and it's in a town that's halfway between Limoges and Tours. And inside it, there's picture cycles that are very well preserved. They're actually frescoes, and fresco painting is where you paint pigment onto wet plaster, and the pigment is absorbed into the plaster so that when it dries, it forms a very strong bond, and frescoes last for, well, thousands of years, unless it's damp. Here, well, let me show you. This is, you can see here in the ceiling, the barrel vaulting, and between the vaulting there is a whole series, in fact 460 square meters of 50 brightly coloured episodes from the Old Testament, and let me show you one of them. This is Noah's Ark, which was a very popular subject at the time, and it's one of those scenes from the ceiling. It looks like a Viking ship. There's a sort of monster head on the prow. There's a 3-story building, and at the back there's a little wheelhouse as described in the Bible. I now move on to an example of Romanesque tapestry, and I'll just be showing you one example. Very little survives, of course, because it's well, in this case it's about 700 years old, and tapestry tends to get mould and rot and not survive that long. It's slightly post-Romanesque, it's 14th century, but it's heavily influenced by the Romanesque traditions. It was originally 140 metres long, but it's now in fragments. It was originally commissioned by Louis I, the Duke of Anjou, and it illustrates scenes from the Book of Revelation again, and it was made in Paris between 1377 and 1382, and there are about 90 scenes shown. It's I think the most significant and almost the only survivor from this period. And the other relevant thing about it is that it's from the very beginning of the great period of tapestry making, which runs from about 1350 to the 17th century, when painting overtook it as the most expensive and prestigious form of artistic creation. So during that period, it was tapestries which were the most expensive, the most prestigious items of art. I won't tell you, I mean, there's 90 scenes, but let me show you one of them. This is Death, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It's slightly unusual as it shows Death as a decayed corpse, which is following a style that was then prevalent in England. The more common style at this time in the 14th century was to show Death as a conventional living person. The 4 horsemen were, of course, harbingers of the last judgment at the end of days, and the 4 of them were pestilence, war, famine, and death. Incidentally, this tapestry was looted, cut into pieces, and used as floor mats and to cover holes in buildings, and even to protect orange trees from frost during the French Revolution. After, in the 19th century, most of it was recovered, repaired, and it's now on display at the Chateau Angers in France, in Angers, of course. Now, I've been talking about France up to now because that's really the centre of Romanesque art, but there's much surviving in other countries. So let me briefly now go through some examples from other countries. This is Italy. This is what I'm going to show you. This is the Church of San Angelo in Formis. It's about 30 kilometres north of Naples, and it's on the main road to Rome. It was built on the site of an ancient Roman temple dedicated to Diana, and it got converted into a church. Now, if we go through the door you see here and turn around as we go in, we see this, a Last Judgment fresco. Striking example of Romanesque art, and it's a significant piece of Christian iconography from this period. You can see hell, Christ in the centre near the top, 4 angels right at the top blowing trumpets. It's obviously the day of judgment. Bottom right is hell and bottom left is heaven. And it's a bit hard to see, but surrounding Christ there are angels, and some of them are holding instruments of the Passion, the cross and nails and so on, to remind us of the sacrifice he made. And the trumpet blowing at the top is to awaken the dead who are going to be judged. We move to the north of Italy. This is Lake Como, and this is the church of San Pietro al Monte near Civate in northern Italy. And again here, if you enter this small church and turn around, you see this above the door. It's chapter 12 of the Book of Revelation again. I think I'll read the section because it's a good description of what you see here. Then there appeared a great sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. That's this woman over here, this is the sun. Then another with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and cried out in labour and travail of childbirth. Then another sign appeared in the sky, a huge red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its head 7 diadems. Its tail dragged down 1/3 of the stars in the sky and hurled them down to the earth. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth to devour the newborn child. She gave birth to a male child destined to rule all nations with an iron sceptre, and the child was immediately raptured to God and to his throne. The woman, on the other hand, fled into the desert where God had prepared a refuge for her to be nourished there for 1,260 days. End quote. The fresco itself shows elements in the figures at the top of the Byzantine style, but it's the figures are more robust than Byzantine figures, are more expressive, and there's a clearer narrative thread running through it, which are all elements of the Romanesque style. And before leaving Italy, I must show you the Cappella Palatina in Palermo, Sicily. It's hard to do justice to it in a photograph. It's a mixture of Byzantine, Norman and Fatimid architectural styles. It was built around 1080 by the Norman conqueror Roger I, although the building you see today was actually commissioned by his son Roger II in 1132. The mosaics are unparalleled. They're the oldest, I'm showing you the oldest here, and they were probably the work of Byzantine craftsmen around 1140, in the 1140s. This is a photograph I took of it a few years ago. Just briefly moving on to Spain, this is an altar front from La Selle d'Oreiller, or in English, the Cathedral of Urgell in Catalonia. It's from the second quarter of the 12th century. Note the symmetry. This is much more typical Byzantine art, though it has some differences. In other words, it's a Romanesque period heavily influenced by Byzantine art. It's Christ in Majesty. He's shown in a double mandorla, and the Bible talks about his throne being the ark of heaven and the earth his footstool, as we see here. The sphere below his feet are the earth, and the disciples are arranged in tiers and holding scrolls or books. St. Peter with the keys is on the left, and St. Paul is shown opposite with his hair shaven or part shaven, tonsured. The figure here. This is San Isidoro de Leon in northern Spain, and it contains some of the finest examples of Romanesque art in Spain. This shows you part of the interior, but what I wanted to show you is that there's so many elements to it, but what I wanted to show you is something that illustrates the everyday life of workers in the area, which I think is quite interesting. These are the months of the year. It actually starts, well, let me point. This is the first month, January, and it contains a two-faced figure. That's a figure who's looking back to the old year and forward to the new. Above it is February, showing a man warming himself by the fire. March is a man pruning the vines. And then April, we go down here, a man with 2 plants ready for sowing. Then a knight with a shield signifying hunting. June and July are these two, showing harvesting. August is a man winnowing, that is separating the wheat from the chaff. September it shows someone harvesting the grapes ready for winemaking. October, there is someone shaking an oak tree to bring down the acorns to feed the pigs, to fatten them for winter. And then in November, the pig is slaughtered. And finally in December, we close the year with a man sitting by himself by the fire. This is from Catalonia in Spain. In fact, what we're looking at here are reproductions. This is some of the most important Romanesque art in Catalonia. It's from Sant Climent de Tui, discovered in the 20th century and moved to the National Museum of Catalonia for preservation, and replicas were created and placed in the church, which we see here. The central image is called Christ Pantocrator, and he's in a mandorla, and his right hand is raised in blessing, and the left hand is holding an open book with an inscription, Ergo Sum Lux Mundi, I am the light of the world. And surrounding him are the apostles and archangels. Incidentally, Christ Pantocrator is very similar to Christ in majesty, but they're from different traditions. Pantocrator is the term we use to describe Christ in this pose from the tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Christ in Majesty is the Western Romanesque Church. This is a tapestry, very old tapestry, in fact even older than the one we saw before, the Tapestry of Creation. It's in Catalonia, Girona Cathedral, and it depicts scenes from the Bible, including the creation, the life of Christ, various saints. But the one I'll focus on is this one here, which is the creation of Adam. And the inscription up here reads, in translation, Adam has not found anyone similar to himself. What that means is there's none of the animals that have been created are like him, so he can find no humans, if you like, amongst the animals. Moving to Germany now. This is the Codex Aureus of Echternach, created around 1030. It's Romanesque and reflects the strong influence of the preceding Ottonian period, which was a continuation, if you remember from my talk, of the Carolingian traditions, which integrated Byzantine elements. It was produced in the Abbey of Echternach, which is in modern-day Luxembourg, and its use of gold gave rise to the name. I called it the Codex Aureus, and Aureus means golden. So it's the Golden Codex of Echternach. It contains many full-page miniatures depicting scenes from the Gospels, pictures of the evangelists and other imagery, and it's well known for its bright... Well, let me show you one of the scenes. This is one of the parables, and there are many parables illustrated as well, like the parable of the wicked husbandman, the parable of the great banquet, but this one is the rich man and Lazarus. There's a rich man, unnamed, and a poor man, a beggar named Lazarus. They both die at the same time. The rich man, as you can see at the bottom, goes to hell and implores Abraham to send Lazarus back, to bring him to life, to warn the rich man's family to change their ways so they don't share his fate. Abraham replies, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, They will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. The Codex also includes this, and I'm showing you this as an interesting scene of everyday life. It's a parable of the workers in the vineyard, and it's showing the workers in the vineyard in the medieval period. This is Henry the Lion, the Duke of Saxony, commissioned this gospel book for Brunswick Cathedral, which is near Hanover in northern Germany, and it contains 4 gospels, some 50 full-page illustrations. Interestingly, it was sold at Sotheby's. Most of these items, the portable items I've shown you, are never sold. They're owned by the nation. But this one was sold in 1983 for £8 million, making it the most expensive book ever sold at its time, until about 10 years later, 1994, when Bill Gates bought the Codex Leicester of Leonardo da Vinci for $30.8 million. And then much more recently, 2021, the Codex Sassoon, which was a nearly complete Hebrew Bible, sold for $38.1 million, I think, making it the most expensive book so far to be sold. This book, sadly, the Gospel of Henry the Lion, is only displayed once every 2 years for security reasons, but this is one of the pages from the book. It shows Henry the Lion getting married, the ducal coronation alongside, or getting crowned, alongside his young wife Matilda of England. She was the daughter of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and although she was 27 years younger than the Duke, in his absence when he was away, he put her in charge of his vast estates, and she ruled them well. We now, to finish the Romanesque, I've chosen a few churches and a tapestry from England. This perhaps is the most famous, or certainly one of the most famous Romanesque cathedrals in the country. It's Durham Cathedral. And I'll focus on Durham Cathedral and the White Tower at the Tower of London. This is perhaps the best preserved Romanesque cathedral in England. Incidentally, it should perhaps more accurately be described as Norman, but I think of Norman as a form of Romanesque architecture, and if it's Norman, I use the two terms interchangeably. It was founded, the foundation stone was laid in 93, and the choir was completed shortly after, 3 years later, in 1096. Note the rounded arches, immense thick walls, and if we look inside, you'll notice the massive columns supporting the building and the zigzag decoration, typical Norman decorative element. Incidentally, the ceiling, you'll notice, is not a barrel vault. It's the first rib vaulted ceiling, and that's typically regarded as an element of early Gothic, so there's slight transition here. And although the ribs add some structural support, we believe they were added for aesthetic reasons. I won't go into the whole history of Durham Cathedral because that would be a talk in itself. This is the White Tower, the original keep of the Tower of London. A keep, of course, is a large tower in the centre of a medieval castle, the inner protected sanctum. It was built by William the Conqueror in 1080 to protect himself. and it's one of the most complete 11th century palaces in Europe and one of the largest keeps in the Christian world. It was originally constructed from Kentish ragstone and Caen stone from France, although in the 17th century Inigo Jones replaced the Caen stone with Portland stone. And the other change is that many of the windows were enlarged in the 18th century. The round projection you see here is the chapel in the White Tower. It's called the White Tower because about 100 years after it was built, Henry III began this tradition of whitewashing the tower, and that gave rise to its name. And in fact, he was so particular that he ordered the guttering to be extended so that the clean white walls wouldn't be stained by what he called the trickling of the rain. The other point of note is that the entrance door was on the first floor, and that was for security reasons. And there was, at the time it was built, a wooden staircase leading up to the door, which could easily be destroyed, removed in the event of attack, making it very difficult to get into the White Tower. And I thought I would finish with architecture, with buildings in England, with this church, St. John's Church in Devizes, which I visited a couple of weeks ago. The reason I'm showing it is that I just wanted to make the point that there are literally over 1,000 churches in England with Norman features, often just part of the church, as here. Let me point them out. Notice the tower has got rounded windows, as has the chancel at the back here and here, and these were built about 1130 by the Bishop of Salisbury, whereas this bit, the transept, and this chapel over here are 15th century and contain, as you can see, Gothic elements, pointed arches, and that's, I find, what makes churches so interesting to visit. Part of the fun of visiting churches is to sort out the various periods and styles and how they interweave with each other. A couple of other works of art. This is the Cloisters Cross. It's now, in fact, in the Met in New York, although it's thought to have been originally made for the Abbey at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, England. And it's one of the masterpieces of Romanesque art. It's got some 92 figures, 98 inscriptions, and I'm showing both sides of it. On the left, you can see a stylized trunk of a tree leading to scenes showing the death and resurrection of Christ. On the other side, we see Hebrew prophets holding scrolls, and in the middle, the Lamb of God. The symbols of the evangelists are shown on the terminals, and incidentally, the angel of Matthew was once at the bottom. It's now lost. I should point out that it does contain, or you can't read it from this, there are several strong abusive comments against Jews. This anti-Jewish sentiment was common in 12th century England, and the scrolls contain inscriptions that criticise the Jews for their failure to recognise Christ as the Messiah. That's the most common theme. That the Jews were blind to the truth of Christianity as medieval Christians saw it. And in fact, at the end of the 13th century in 1290, Edward I expelled all 3,000 Jews from England, and they weren't allowed to return for some 360 years. There's a lot of information about this cross. If you want more information, the Met provides a PDF book with some over 300 pages describing this cross and its iconography, and there's a link to the Met's book on the notes of this talk on my website, and you can find a link to that in the text on YouTube. This is the Winchester Bible, and on the right, one of the pages called the Morgan Leaf. The Morgan Leaf from the Winchester Bible is actually now in New York. It was produced in the 12th century between, we think, 1160 and 1175 in Winchester, England. And the Morgan Leaf is in the Morgan Library in New York and contains scenes from the Old Testament, scenes from the life of Samuel and David. You can, in fact, the clearest bit is at the top, you can see David confronting Goliath, and then you can see David here cutting off Goliath's head. A very strong narrative set of images, fairly realistic figures, and so we're showing quite a refined example of Romanesque art. Oh, this is interesting. I've just taken out one page from the Canterbury Psalter of 1150, Trinity College, Cambridge. It's interesting because it's very unusual. It shows a portrait of one of the monks who produced it, Edwin. And portraits are very, very rare, except, of course, for patrons who we start to see appearing. The monk is believed to be one of the scribes. He's seated at his desk writing, and there's an inscription which reads, "Edwin was praised above all the brothers," and it describes him as the Prince of Scribes. And so he was so highly regarded that he was allowed, we don't know whether it's actually produced by him, drawn by him, whether it's a self-portrait or a portrait, but his portrait was allowed to be included. It was produced at Christ Church, Canterbury. It was in the monastery there, and I should add that the monasteries, I mentioned right at the beginning how many monasteries were being founded across Europe because of the religious fervour. Monasteries became the centre of intellectual and artistic creativity, vibrancy across Europe. They were the hubs of which intellectual life circulated, as well as the courts of Europe. And then finally, I thought I'd come back to the Bayeux tapestry. I should add, of course, that it's not a tapestry. It's an embroidered cloth. A tapestry is woven. This is a cloth whose narrative figures are created using embroidery. It's an example of Norman art and has an intense focus on narrative. And we think it was commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who was William the Conqueror's half-brother. And we also think it was probably created in England by Anglo-Saxon artisans, although it's now in Bayeux in France. It tells a complex story. It tells the complete story of the conquest of England as told by the Normans, and so it is a work of propaganda produced by the victorious Normans. And this section, the section I'm showing you, has been taught to school children as the way that King Harold died, by being struck in the eye with an arrow. And this is the moment that England lost to the Normans. However, as often with history, it's never quite that simple. If you look at the full inscription, and in fact we can't actually see, it says Hic Harold Rex interfectus est. King Harold was killed here. and the name Harold is written above the warrior with an arrow in his eye, but the word interfectus est has been killed, appears to refer to the second warrior down here being hacked down by a mounted Norman swordsman. And as the tapestry is our only source, we don't know which of the two figures is meant to be King Harold. The first reference to Harold being killed with an arrow in the eye is a poem, but it wasn't written until 100 years later. And so we don't know. We do know that at the time, an arrow in the eye was sometimes symbolic of someone who told a lie. And the Norman propaganda is that Harold had been shipwrecked in northern France and in due course had made an oath that William the Conqueror would become the next king of England. And Harold fighting William the Conqueror, the Normans saw as him breaking that oath. And so there's a whole backstory behind this that is told by the tapestry. That brings us to the end. I'll leave you to judge which figure is Harold and whether it's an accurate representation, remembering the famous slogan, "History is written by the victors." Of course, it did strike me the other day that, of course, it's possible that both are true, that what happened is that Harold was struck by an arrow in or near his eye. He pulled it out and was partly blinded, and as a result was struck down and killed by a horseman. So that's my interpretation for what it's worth. And that brings me to the end of this brief introduction to Romanesque art. The next talk in the historic sequence is on Gothic cathedrals. I start in France and show how this new Gothic architecture spread across Europe. Thank you for your attention and goodbye for now.